In the marble city of Pergamon, high above the Aegean Sea, a boy wandered between temple halls and healing chambers. His name was Galen, born in 129 AD, the son of a wealthy architect who wanted more for his child than stones and blueprints. Pergamon was no ordinary city. It was home to a great library, second only to Alexandria. And it was here that Galen's curiosity blossomed, not toward fame, but toward the human body, its mysteries, its ailments, and how to ease its suffering. At 6, he watched a slave collapse in the street. Instead of turning away, he ran to fetch help. At 10, he asked the temple priest why a man bled from the mouth, not out of fear, but fascination. By the age of 16, Galen was training at the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing. He watched surgeons cut open flesh by torchlight, listened to the cries of the wounded, and took notes. Always notes, more than anyone else. One night, a farmer stumbled into the temple, his leg shredded by a wild boar. While others hesitated, young Galen steadied the man's head, whispered calming words, and assisted in the stitching. When the man walked again weeks later, he blessed Galen like a saint. But this was a mere fascination. It was devotion. Galen believed medicine wasn't just a science. It was a moral calling. When his father died, Galen could have lived comfortably. Instead, he gave away much of his inheritance and set off to Smyrna, to Alexandria, to Corinth, seeking knowledge like a pilgrim chases sacred fire. In Alexandria, he dissected animals and studied the heart of a monkey for hours, sketching its chambers while others slept. In Corinth, he slept beside the sick to study their symptoms firsthand. And wherever he went, he treated the poor for free. One old woman, trembling with fever, said to him, "Why would a rich man touch a beggar's skin?" Galen simply smiled and replied, "Because kindness has no class." Now, take a deep breath. Let the weight of the day fall off your shoulders. Close your eyes, or let them rest gently. You're safe here. Tonight, we'll travel back in time, not to witness war or fear, but to remember an act of kindness the world must never forget. Welcome to Kind Nights. Let's begin. When Galen returned to Pergamon in his late 20s, he accepted a position that most doctors avoided, physician to the city's gladiators. It was a brutal world. The training grounds echoed with grunts and screams, and the arena was a place where men were broken for entertainment. Gladiators fought not just for victory, but for survival. Galen entered this world not with weapons, but with precision. He examined every fighter before and after training. He tracked bruises, cuts, muscle strains. He developed a personal file for each man, predicting which injuries would return and how to avoid them. His tools were sharp, but his eyes were sharper. One morning, a champion fighter named Euanthes took a blade to the thigh. The gash was deep. The crowd roared for mercy, but the guards were ready to drag him away. Galen intervened. In front of the entire amphitheater, he cleaned the wound with wine, stitched muscle to muscle, and used a mix of crushed herbs and honey to pack the cut. "He will walk," Galen told them. "He will fight again." 2 months later, Euanthes returned to the arena. He won. And afterward, he lifted Galen's hand high in front of thousands. Galen's survival rate among the gladiators became legendary. While other doctors let injured fighters die because they were slaves, criminals, or foreigners, Galen treated each one like his own brother. He refused to accept bribes from owners wanting to dispose of sick fighters. Once, he was threatened by a nobleman who wanted a rival's fighter declared unfit. Galen stared him down and said, "My oath is to healing, not favor. He became a quiet protector in a blood-soaked world, and in doing so, he earned not just respect, but loyalty. One evening, a young fighter broke 3 ribs and punctured a lung. Galen kept him alive by draining the fluid with a hollow reed and instructing his assistants to keep him upright for days. The man survived. He limped into Galen's chambers weeks later and kissed his hand. In the arena, Galen was more than a doctor. He was hope. Rome, the heart of the empire, beat with the rhythm of trade, politics, and conquest. But when Galen arrived in the capital, that rhythm had begun to falter. In 166 AD, the Antonine plague crept into the city, likely brought back by returning soldiers from the Eastern Front. It began with fevers, then coughs, then rashes that oozed, and then death swift and contagious. As thousands died daily, physicians and priests fled. Streets were deserted, temples closed, and the smell of burning incense, meant to purify the air, choked the alleys. Galen had just returned from a post in Aquileia when he was summoned to the imperial court. But instead of remaining in the palace, he went to the city's slums, where the poor lay groaning under thin blankets. In one house, he found a mother with 3 children, all burning with fever. He sent for food, wine, and clean cloth, then returned every day for a week. Only the youngest survived. Galen wept, but did not stop. In another case, a soldier lay convulsing in the mud outside the gates. Galen knelt, placed a soaked cloth on his brow, and whispered, "You will not die alone." The man died that night, but Galen stayed with him till his final breath. He opened corpses despite the taboo to understand the infection. He recorded each symptom, progression, and pattern. He wrote not to impress, but to equip future doctors with knowledge. By candlelight, he dictated remedies: theriacs, vinegar compresses, honey-based bombs. He argued for fresh air, hydration, and isolation, centuries before the science caught up. Even when summoned by Emperor Marcus Aurelius, Galen insisted on finishing his rounds. When asked why he risked his life, he replied, "A physician who flees is no better than the plague." He published treatises during the crisis, hoping to save strangers he'd never meet. Rome, cracked and gasping, looked to him, not for miracles, but for care. Calm. Compassion. He never promised life, only effort. And, to many, that was enough. When the worst of the Antonine plague began to subside, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, invited Galen to serve as his personal physician in the palace. It was a role of immense power and privilege. Silver trays of figs and honey lined the tables. Gold-embroidered curtains rippled in the breeze from marble colonnades. Here, far from the city's suffering, Galen could have lived in peace. But Galen did not come to rest. He established a medical library within the palace walls and trained young physicians by candlelight. He continued writing treatises, not in Latin for the nobles, but in plain Greek, so commoners and apprentices could learn. Twice a week, Galen walked outside the palace to tend to the sick. He kept a makeshift clinic near the Tiber where the poor lined up at dawn. Some were war widows. Some were children burned by oil lamps. All were treated. When courtiers criticized him, saying palace physicians should not lower themselves, Galen answered, "The body does not know rank, nor does kindness." He worked closely with Marcus Aurelius, who respected Galen's ethics. When famine struck Gaul, Galen convinced the emperor to reroute grain to starving villages instead of the Senate's banquets. In one memorable moment, A young noble fell gravely ill with a fever. His mother begged Galen to use every remedy. Galen insisted on slow cooling and rest. He sat at the boy's bedside for 2 days, watching, adjusting. The boy recovered. The mother wept, not only for her son, but for the man who had saved him without pride. Even amid power, Galen remained humble. Once, when asked why he refused statues in his honor, he replied, "I'd rather they remember the relief on a healed face than the shape of mine in stone." Galen turned the palace, a place of politics and pride, into one of service, and in doing so, reminded the most powerful men in the world what true strength looked like. Galen lived through 5 emperors, 2 wars, and at least 3 major epidemics. His hands stitched flesh, but his real monument was ink. He wrote constantly. When not treating the sick, he dictated to scribes. His writings filled shelves, over 500 books and scrolls, from surgical technique to moral philosophy. One night, while caring for a man whose intestines had been pierced in battle, Galen sketched diagrams on parchment with charcoal. Those drawings would later help save lives for centuries. His dissections of pigs and monkeys revealed how nerves worked, how the brain was connected to thought, even how to perform complex surgeries like cataract removals and bladder stones. But his kindness wasn't just in his science. It lived in how he taught. He insisted that students learn not only anatomy, but empathy. "If you cannot weep for a man's pain," he told a young physician, "you should not cut him open." He advocated for the humane treatment of the mentally ill, unheard of in his time, arguing that their minds, too, could be healed with care, not chains. In one touching account, he cared for a mute child who had been abandoned. Galen brought him to the palace gardens daily, teaching him gestures and watching him slowly express joy for the first time. He called it one of his life's greatest rewards, not in discovery, but in dignity restored. His fame spread east and west. Arab scholars translated his works into Arabic centuries later. In Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, his books were treated like sacred knowledge. In medieval Europe, his words shaped medicine for over 1,000 years. Even when some of his science became outdated, his ethical code lived on. Treat the suffering without prejudice. Study endlessly. Heal with both hand and heart. He never stopped learning. In his final years, Galen wrote a guide for physicians on how to remain calm during crises. It was less about medicine and more about the soul. And when he died, likely around 216 AD, there was no grand funeral, no parade. Only silence in the palace clinic, and a few scribes who continued copying his final manuscript. He left no heirs, no armies, no gold. But he left behind a map of mercy, traced in ink and sealed in kindness. As the stars rise and the world around you grows still, let your thoughts settle on the quiet strength of Galen, a man who walked through war, plague, and politics with a steady hand and an open heart. He never wore armor, but he stood at the front lines. He never ruled a nation, but he shaped empires of knowledge and care. His tools were not swords, but scalpels and scrolls. His battles were against suffering, and his victories were measured not in land, but in lives saved. When Rome trembled, he brought calm. When others fled, he stayed. When silence hung heavy in sick rooms, his voice soothed. And in every act, whether stitching a wound or comforting a mother, he chose kindness. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember this. Greatness does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through a healer's hands. through a mind devoted to mercy. Sleep in the warmth of Galen's legacy, a legacy carved not in stone, but in the hearts of those who still carry it forward. Good night.